The cabin was alive with the sound of pre-flight chatter, rustling newspapers, and the occasional mechanical click of overhead compartments being shut. Marcus Bennett, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that hinted at both his success and sharp taste, settled into his first-class seat. It was a rare moment of quiet for the accomplished lawyer. As he adjusted his seatbelt, he allowed himself a brief smile. This trip wasn't just business, it was a chance to unwind after weeks of grueling negotiations. Across the aisle, a man in his mid-40s leaned toward the flight attendant, his voice barely audible, but laced with irritation. Marcus noticed the quick, darting glances in his direction. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe the man was complaining about the lack of overhead bin space or a delay in boarding. But as the whispers persisted, a knot began to form in Marcus's stomach. The flight attendant, a young woman whose polite smile barely concealed her discomfort, approached Marcus. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Her tone was professional, but her eyes flickered with an apology she couldn't voice. Marcus handed over his neatly folded pass without hesitation. The flight attendant scanned it quickly, her expression softening as she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Everything seems to be in order. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." She returned the boarding pass, but the man across the aisle wasn't satisfied. His voice rose, cutting through the ambient hum of the cabin. "Are you sure? People like him don't usually sit up here." The words landed like a slap, sharp and unmistakable. Conversations around them faltered, and heads turned. Marcus felt the weight of their stares. He'd been here before, too many times to count. The disbelief, the judgment, the insinuation that his presence was somehow unwarranted, it was a story he knew by heart. "Excuse me?" Marcus's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet demand for clarity. The man leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms as if settling into a battle. "I just think there's been a mistake. He probably got his ticket mixed up." The flight attendant hesitated, her gaze bouncing between Marcus and the man. It was a split second, but long enough for the tension to thicken. Marcus took a deep breath, his fingers curling around the armrest. Years of experience had taught him to keep his composure in moments like this. "I assure you," he said evenly, "there's no mistake. My ticket is valid, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Despite his measured tone, the atmosphere in the cabin felt charged. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman, seated a row behind Marcus, muttered loud enough for others to hear, "This is ridiculous. Just let him be." The flight attendant nodded quickly, retreating toward the galley. For a moment, Marcus thought the situation might de-escalate. But the man across the aisle wasn't ready to back down. "I don't know what's going on with this airline," the man said loudly, addressing no one in particular, but ensuring everyone could hear. First class used to mean something. A ripple of discomfort spread through the cabin. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd faced bias in courtrooms, boardrooms, and even grocery stores, but it never got easier. He knew he was being watched, judged, and measured. He glanced out the window, the runway lights twinkling against the fading dusk. The thought crossed his mind to let it go, to not make a scene. But why should he? Why should he have to shrink himself to accommodate someone else's ignorance? A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sir," a uniformed police officer said, stepping into the cabin. "I need you to come with me." The officer's presence sent a wave of unease through the passengers. Murmurs broke out, a mix of curiosity and outrage. Marcus turned his gaze to the officer, his expression unreadable. "And why would that be?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "We've had a report about your seat assignment. We need to verify your information. The officer's tone was authoritative, but not hostile. Still, the implication stung. Marcus felt his heart pound, his mind racing through the options. Stand up and comply? Or hold his ground and demand an explanation? He glanced at the faces around him, some supportive, others merely curious. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about dignity, respect, and the exhausting battle to prove his worth in spaces that should have welcomed him without question. He made his decision. "No," Marcus said, his voice ringing with quiet defiance. "I'm not going anywhere until you explain why I'm being asked to leave a seat I paid for." The officer hesitated, caught off guard by Marcus's calm resistance. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers beginning to rally behind him. As Marcus sat there, unwavering, he thought about the countless others who had faced similar indignities, but chose silence for the sake of peace. Not this time, he told himself. Not today. The hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. Marcus Bennett adjusted his watch and leaned back into the plush comfort of his first-class chair. This trip had been meticulously planned, a rare moment to breathe after weeks of late nights and high-stakes cases. As he reached for the in-flight magazine, he noticed a peculiar tension rippling through the cabin. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man with a crisp blue shirt and an air of self-importance darted glances in Marcus's direction. The man leaned toward the flight attendant, his expression a mixture of annoyance and indignation. At first, Marcus dismissed it. Perhaps the man had a mundane request to drink order or a question about the flight schedule. But as the whispers continued, it became apparent that the subject of the man's agitation wasn't the service. It was him. The flight attendant, a young woman with carefully pinned hair and the practiced smile of someone trained to diffuse tension, hesitated. Her gaze flickered briefly toward Marcus before she made her way down the aisle. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, her voice laced with an uneasy politeness. "May I see your boarding pass?" Marcus's brows knit together in confusion, but he handed her the neatly folded pass without question. Her eyes scanned it quickly, and a flash of relief crossed her face. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," she said, returning it. "Everything looks to be in order. I apologize for the interruption." As she stepped back, Marcus glanced toward the man who had prompted the check. His face tightened, displeasure radiating from him like heat off asphalt. The man's voice rose, pointed and unmistakable, drawing attention from the rows around them. "Are you sure that's right?" he demanded, his tone laced with disbelief. "People like him don't usually sit up here." The words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Conversations faltered, and an uncomfortable silence spread through the cabin. Marcus felt the weight of every pair of eyes turning toward him. He had prepared for this flight, as he did every aspect of his life, with meticulous attention to detail. But no amount of preparation could shield him from the sting of those words. Taking a measured breath, Marcus met the man's gaze. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. The man crossed his arms, leaning back into his seat as though he just stated an irrefutable truth. "I just think there's been a mistake," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't exactly look like the type who belongs in first class." A ripple of murmurs began, passengers glancing between Marcus and the man. Some faces held sympathy, others mere curiosity, but no one spoke up. Marcus straightened in his seat, his calm composure belying the anger simmering beneath the surface. He had spent years navigating spaces where he was the only one who looked like him, where his qualifications were scrutinized more harshly than anyone else's. But this wasn't a courtroom or a boardroom. This was supposed to be a peaceful flight home. Before Marcus could respond, a woman seated behind him leaned forward. Her voice was clear, her tone sharp with irritation. "This is ridiculous," she said, addressing the flight attendant. "He's already shown you his boarding pass. Just let the man enjoy his flight." The flight attendant nodded, her cheeks flushing. "Yes, of course," she said, stepping away as though hoping to avoid further escalation. But the man wasn't satisfied. "It's not just about his boarding pass," he said, his voice rising. "First class used to mean something. Standards used to matter." Marcus clenched his jaw, the words hitting him harder than he expected. He had worked tirelessly to achieve everything he had, yet moments like this made it clear how fragile respect could be in the face of ignorance. He looked out the window, the runway lights blurring against the darkening sky. For a moment, he considered letting it go. He could retreat into silence, as he had so many times before, and allow the flight to proceed without further incident. But something inside him resisted. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for every person who had been made to feel unwelcome, unworthy, or out of place. He turned back to the man, his voice measured but unyielding. "I earned this seat, just like anyone else here. If you have a problem with that, perhaps you should question your own assumptions instead of mine." A murmur of agreement rippled through the passengers, small but unmistakable. The man shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering under the weight of public scrutiny. The flight attendant returned, her expression a mix of apology and determination. "Mr. Bennett, is there anything else I can get you?" she asked, her voice louder now, as though trying to make amends for her earlier hesitation. Marcus shook his head, his eyes still locked on the man across the aisle. "No," he said calmly. "I'm fine." As the tension began to subside, Marcus felt a sense of quiet resolve settle over him. This wasn't over. Not yet. But he had no intention of backing down. The hum of the engines seemed to dim as the tension in the cabin grew palpable. The sharp tap of footsteps echoed through the narrow aisle, drawing the attention of every passenger. A uniformed police officer, his badge gleaming under the overhead lights, entered the plane with an air of authority that silenced even the most persistent murmurs. Seated in his first-class seat, Marcus Bennett felt a familiar weight settle on his chest, an unwelcome companion he knew all too well. He had hoped the confrontation would end with the whispers and pointed accusations, but now it was clear this wasn't just another uncomfortable moment. It was an ordeal. "Mr. Bennett," the officer asked, his tone professional but firm. Marcus turned his gaze toward him, calm but unwavering. "Yes, we need you to step off the plane with us," the officer continued. "There's been a report of an issue with your seat assignment." Around him, passengers began to stir. Disbelief rippled through the cabin, some faces registering quiet outrage, others merely watching with detached curiosity. A middle-aged woman seated 2 rows back muttered audibly, "This is ridiculous." "What's happening to this world?" Marcus folded his hands neatly in his lap. He could feel the eyes of the man across the aisle boring into him, that self-satisfied smirk radiating vindication. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about dignity his own, and that of anyone who had ever been judged on sight. "Officer," Marcus said evenly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "I'd like to understand what exactly is being questioned here. I've shown my boarding pass. It's valid. Why am I being asked to leave?" The officer hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. He glanced at the flight attendant, who stood nearby with an uneasy expression. She avoided Marcus's gaze, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "We've received a concern from another passenger," the officer said, his words deliberate but vague. "We just need to verify everything before proceeding." Marcus leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. He'd spent his career dissecting language, understanding the subtleties of phrasing, and this officer's words reeked of hesitation. The so-called concern was little more than prejudice cloaked in bureaucracy. "Let me clarify something," Marcus said, his tone measured but firm. "Are you asking me to leave because of an actual issue with my ticket, or because someone doesn't believe I belong here?" The officer shifted, his discomfort evident. Around them, the murmurs of the passengers grew louder. "Maybe you should investigate the person making the accusation," a man seated nearby interjected, his voice carrying a note of defiance. "This doesn't seem right." "Exactly," a younger woman chimed in, crossing her arms. "He's done nothing wrong." "Why are you targeting him?" The officer glanced around, clearly aware of the growing unrest. His authoritative demeanor faltered under the weight of the passengers' collective scrutiny. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the moment settle. He thought of the countless times he had been asked to explain himself, to prove his worth, to justify his presence in spaces that should have been accessible to all. It wasn't just exhausting, it was dehumanizing. "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus said, his voice steady but resolute. "Not until I understand why I'm being singled out." The officer's lips tightened, his gaze flicking toward the flight attendant for support. She hesitated, her face pale as she finally spoke. The gentleman across the aisle raised concerns about Mr. Bennett's seat. Marcus turned to the man, his expression calm but unyielding. "You raised a concern," he said, his voice carrying a quiet power. "Would you care to explain it to me directly?" The man shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado dimming under the weight of Marcus's unwavering gaze. "I just thought there might have been a mistake," he muttered, his voice trailing off. "A mistake?" Marcus repeated, his tone sharp but measured. "Or an assumption?" The cabin fell silent. Even the faint whir of the engines seemed to fade as Marcus's words hung in the air. The officer cleared his throat, clearly realizing the situation had escalated far beyond his control. "Sir," he began, addressing Marcus with a softer tone, "I understand this is frustrating, but we need to ensure everything is in order." "Then I suggest you verify the facts," Marcus replied, his voice unyielding. "Because right now, this isn't about a ticket. This is about prejudice, plain and simple." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, voices of support rising in Marcus's defense. "Let the man stay," one said firmly. "This is an embarrassment for the airline," another added, shaking his head. Marcus felt a surge of quiet resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about challenging a system that allowed bias to masquerade as policy. As the officer stood there, uncertain and increasingly aware of the public backlash, Marcus met his gaze. "I'll leave," Marcus said finally, his tone calm but deliberate, "if you can give me one valid reason. But if not, I suggest you rethink who really needs to step off this plane." The officer said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. The officer's silence was deafening, and for a moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Marcus Bennett sat immobile, his back straight against the cushioned first-class seat, his hands resting on his lap. Outwardly, he appeared composed, but inside, a storm of emotions churned. Anger, frustration, and the weariness of a battle fought too many times weighed heavily on him. The tension in the air was almost tangible, stretching thin as passengers exchanged glances. A woman seated 2 rows back broke the silence with a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "This is absolutely absurd," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. You're harassing a man for sitting in the seat he paid for. Do you hear yourselves? Marcus's gaze shifted toward her, gratitude flickering briefly in his eyes. Her support was a balm, even if it didn't undo the sting of the situation. But then, his focus turned inward. The past began to creep in, uninvited but unavoidable. He thought of the countless times he'd been forced to defend his place in rooms he had every right to be in. The whispers in college classrooms, questioning how someone like him could have been admitted to such a prestigious institution. The raised eyebrows during corporate meetings, as though his presence required an explanation. Even the subtle hesitations in handshakes, the fleeting moments when judgment outweighed respect. It was always the same. Different places, different faces, but the message was clear. Prove you belong. Marcus's jaw tightened as he reminded himself of the countless hours he had poured into his career. The sleepless nights spent reviewing case law, the battles fought in courtrooms where he had dismantled arguments with precision and poise, the sacrifices he had made to rise to the top of his field. And yet, here he was, once again being questioned not for what he had done, but for who he was. As he reflected, his mind wandered to his late father, a man who had faced his own share of discrimination, but had always taught Marcus to rise above it. Never let them see you lose your dignity, his father would say. But don't ever let them walk over you either. His father's words rang in his ears as he looked at the officer, who still hovered nearby, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Marcus could see the discomfort etched into the man's face. The officer had likely been called into a situation he hadn't fully understood, yet his hesitation suggested he was starting to grasp the gravity of the moment. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but charged with meaning. "Officer, let me ask you something," he began. "If the roles were reversed, if it were me making baseless accusations against another passenger, would you have acted this quickly? Would you have come aboard without question, assuming I was right?" The officer's lips parted, but no words came. Marcus continued, his voice steady, but edged with quiet conviction. "This isn't just about me. It's about how easy it is for someone's bias to become someone else's problem. You have the power to investigate, to question, to look for the truth. But instead, you came for me because someone else's assumption was enough." The cabin was silent once more, but this time, the silence felt heavy with understanding. The passengers weren't just witnesses now, they were participants in a moment that felt larger than any one person. Across the aisle, the man who had started it all shifted uncomfortably. His confidence, once so evident, now seemed to waver under the weight of Marcus's words. "I didn't mean," the man began, but Marcus cut him off with a calm but pointed response. "You didn't mean what? To assume I didn't belong here? To drag an officer into this because my presence made you uncomfortable? Or to show everyone in this cabin what unchecked prejudice looks like in action?" The man's face turned red, his gaze dropping to his lap. Marcus took a deep breath, allowing the moment to settle. He wasn't angry at the officer. The man was a symptom, not the cause. But the other passenger, the one whose ignorance had set this in motion, needed to understand the harm he had caused. Turning back to the officer, Marcus softened his tone. "I understand you have a job to do," he said. "But your job is also to ensure fairness, to question the validity of accusations before acting on them. That's all I'm asking for, not special treatment, just fair treatment." The officer nodded, his expression a mixture of regret and resolve. "You're right, sir," he said, his voice quieter now. "I should have handled this differently." From the rows behind, scattered applause began to rise, hesitant at first, but growing in strength. Marcus felt his chest tighten, not with anger this time, but with an overwhelming sense of vindication. He glanced around the cabin, catching the supportive gazes of several passengers. It was a reminder that, even in the face of ignorance, there were always allies willing to stand up for what was right. As the applause faded, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his composure unbroken, but his heart heavy with the knowledge that the fight was far from over. This was just one battle in a war that had spanned generations. And yet, in this small moment, a step had been taken. A conversation had begun. The cabin was quiet, save for the steady hum of the engines and the occasional shuffle of passengers adjusting in their seats. Marcus Bennett took a deep breath, his calm exterior masking the storm of emotions that swirled within. This was not a battle he had chosen, but it was one he would not shy away from. Across the aisle, the man who had sparked the confrontation avoided Marcus's gaze. His earlier bravado had dissolved into visible discomfort. Meanwhile, the officer, still standing by Marcus's seat, seemed caught in a limbo of duty and regret. Marcus straightened in his seat, meeting the officer's eyes with a steady gaze. "Since we're here, let me offer some context," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "I am not just a passenger on this flight. I am also the lead counsel for Skylex Airlines, the very company that operates this plane." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Several passengers leaned forward, their expressions shifting from curiosity to astonishment. Even the officer seemed momentarily frozen, his brows knitting in disbelief. Marcus allowed the words to sink in before continuing. "I've spent the last few months working tirelessly to ensure this airline avoided a lawsuit that could have cost hundreds of employees their jobs. I've defended this company, its policies, and its people. And yet, here I am, being asked to defend my right to sit in a seat I paid for." The tension in the cabin, already thick, now felt electrified. The man across the aisle, who had been shrinking into his seat, looked up sharply. His face turned a deep shade of red, the realization of his actions hitting him like a tidal wave. "I didn't," he stammered, his voice faltering. "I didn't know." Marcus held up a hand, stopping him. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. All you saw was me, my skin, my presence, and you decided that was enough to question whether I belonged here." The officer cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. "Mr. Bennett, I'm sorry. I didn't realize." Marcus turned to him, his expression softening slightly. "I appreciate your apology, but this isn't just about me. It's about how easy it is for assumptions to turn into actions that humiliate, isolate, and devalue people who've done nothing wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the cabin. The passengers, who had been silent spectators until now, began to murmur amongst themselves. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged glances of discomfort. A young woman seated a row behind Marcus spoke up, her voice clear and steady. "This isn't right. He shouldn't have had to explain himself like this. None of us should." Her words seemed to unlock a flood of agreement. Voices rose in support, each one adding to the chorus of validation. "That's exactly it," Marcus said, his voice carrying a mix of gratitude and determination. "We shouldn't have to explain ourselves. But when we do, when we're forced to confront ignorance and bias, it's an opportunity to change the narrative, to challenge the assumptions that hold us back." The man across the aisle shifted again, his discomfort palpable. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it, struggling to find the words. Finally, he managed, I didn't mean to cause all this." You thought wrong," Marcus interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "But here's the thing you can learn from this. We all can. It's not about what you meant, it's about what your actions caused. And now it's about what you do next." The man nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the moment settled on him. The officer stepped back, his posture less rigid. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice tinged with regret, "I'll make sure this doesn't escalate any further." "You have my word." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said simply. As the officer moved away, Marcus turned his attention back to the cabin. He scanned the faces of the passengers, many of whom now looked at him with a mix of admiration and respect. The earlier tension had given way to a shared understanding, a recognition of the deeper truths Marcus had revealed. "This isn't just about a seat," Marcus said, his voice resonating through the cabin. "It's about what kind of world we want to live in. One where assumptions and prejudices dictate our actions, or one where we take the time to see people for who they really are." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, but growing in strength. Marcus felt a swell of emotion, a mixture of relief, vindication, and hope. This moment, as painful as it had been, was a step toward something greater. As the clapping subsided, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his heart still heavy, but his resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just about him. It was about challenging a system that allowed bias to thrive, about holding people accountable, and about inspiring others to do the same. The applause in the cabin had subsided, but the emotional reverberation lingered. Marcus Bennett remained seated, his posture dignified, his expression a mixture of calm resolve and quiet exhaustion. The ordeal was far from over, and Marcus knew that moments like this demanded more than words. They required accountability. Across the aisle, the man who had triggered the entire situation sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the seat in front of him. The earlier air of confidence he exuded had crumbled into something resembling shame. Marcus could see it, the internal struggle of a man grappling with his own actions. But this wasn't the time for pity. This was a time for clarity. Marcus turned to face the man directly, his voice measured but firm. "You owe me an apology," he said, the words cutting through the ambient noise of the cabin. The man flinched, clearly unprepared for the confrontation. He hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right thing to say. Finally, he managed, "I didn't mean to offend you. You just made an assumption." Marcus interjected, his tone steady but pointed. "An assumption based on nothing but your biases. And that assumption led to this entire situation: humiliation, disruption, and unnecessary conflict." The cabin was quiet again, every passenger tuned into the exchange. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "An apology isn't just about words. It's about acknowledging the harm you've caused and committing to change. So, I'll ask again, do you have something to say to me?" The man's face turned a deep shade of red. He nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, his words heavy with discomfort, but carrying a trace of sincerity. "I was wrong." Marcus nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you," he replied. "But understand this: an apology is just the beginning. What matters is what you do next, how you choose to confront the assumptions you hold, and the impact they have on others." The man nodded again, his head bowing as if under the weight of Marcus's words. The flight attendant, who had remained nearby throughout the confrontation, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Bennett," she began, her voice tinged with remorse. I want to apologize as well. I should have handled this differently. I should have questioned the complaint more thoroughly before involving the officer." Marcus turned to her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with a quiet sigh, he said, "It's not easy to stand up in situations like this. But you have a responsibility, just like the officer, just like all of us, to challenge what's wrong and do what's right." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're right. And I'll do better. I promise." Marcus offered her a small, understanding smile. "That's all I ask." The officer, still standing a few feet away, cleared his throat. His earlier authority had softened into a tone of regret. "Mr. Bennett, I want to apologize again for how I handled this. I acted too quickly, and I didn't ask the questions I should have." Marcus regarded him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Acknowledging that is a good first step," he said. "But understand this, it's not just about me. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else. Use this experience to inform how you approach situations like this in the future." The officer nodded, his expression earnest. "I will." The cabin began to relax, the earlier tension giving way to a sense of collective reflection. Passengers who had been silent spectators now looked at Marcus with newfound respect. Some offered him small nods of acknowledgement, while others whispered words of support to those seated beside them. A middle-aged man across the aisle spoke up, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Mr. Bennett, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for standing your ground and for speaking up. It's inspiring." Marcus looked at him, his gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. He leaned back in his seat, finally allowing himself a moment to breathe. The fight wasn't over, not in the grander sense, but in this small corner of the world. A conversation had begun. As the plane cruised through the sky, Marcus reflected on the importance of accountability. It wasn't about punishment, it was about growth. By demanding acknowledgement and change, he hoped to plant seeds that might one day grow into something greater, a world where people weren't judged by their appearance, but by their actions. He closed his eyes briefly, the hum of the engines providing a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. This moment, as painful and exhausting as it had been, was a reminder of why he did what he did. As a lawyer, as a leader, and as a man, his mission was clear: to challenge injustice and to inspire others to do the same. The moments following the apology felt like a brief but significant calm before the storm. Marcus Bennett sat in his seat, his body still, but his mind working furiously. The apology had been a necessary first step, but he knew this moment was more than just about him. It was about something deeper, something that could ripple outward if the passengers, the people in this very cabin, were willing to listen and reflect. His heart still raced from the adrenaline of the past few minutes, but beneath it, a calm resolve settled. This wasn't just a one-time confrontation. This was a chance to spark something larger, something that could touch not just the lives of those aboard this flight, but perhaps even beyond. Marcus knew that if he didn't seize this moment, it would slip away like so many before it. With a deep breath, Marcus stood up from his seat. His legs felt a little heavy, the weight of what had transpired still lingering. The eyes of the cabin were on him, no longer filled with judgment or suspicion, but with curiosity, uncertainty, and something else that he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the situation. "I'm not going to pretend that what happened here today is unusual. Unfortunately, this happens all the time. It might not always look like this, perhaps not with such dramatic consequences, but in some form or another, we are all confronted with bias, with assumptions, with judgments that have nothing to do with the truth of who we are or what we bring to the table." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. He could see the shift in the faces around him, a mix of reflection and realization. "A few minutes ago," he continued, "I was asked to leave this plane, not because I had done anything wrong, but because someone assumed that I didn't belong here. Now, I want you to think about that. Think about how easy it is to make a judgment based on nothing but the color of my skin, the way I carry myself, or where I sit. Marcus let that thought hang in the air, watching as passengers shifted uncomfortably. He could see their internal struggle, people who were questioning their own biases, the little things they might never have thought about before. "This isn't about me, or about a seat on a plane," Marcus said, his voice growing firmer. "This is about all of us. We live in a world where bias is often invisible, where we act on assumptions without realizing the harm we're causing. We make decisions that affect other people's lives without ever considering the full story. How many times has someone looked at you, or looked at someone else, and decided their worth without ever knowing their name, their struggles, or their dreams?" A quiet murmur passed through the cabin. The tension had shifted, no longer oppressive, but thoughtful. It was as though Marcus had pulled back the veil on something hidden in plain sight. "Let me ask you something," Marcus continued. "How many times have you walked into a room and felt the weight of eyes on you, the questions that aren't asked aloud but are felt deep in your gut? How many times have you been judged for something you didn't choose, something as simple as the color of your skin or the way you speak?" The cabin fell into silence as people began to reflect. Marcus could feel the collective energy shift. He wasn't just talking to them anymore. He was making them confront their own biases, those silent judgments we all carry without even realizing it. "I'm asking you today to do something that might be uncomfortable," Marcus said, his tone gentler now, but no less powerful. "I'm asking you to take a long, hard look at your own assumptions. We all have them. We all carry them. And they shape the way we see the world and the way we treat each other. But that doesn't mean we can't change." He paused again, letting the silence settle over the cabin. "You don't have to be perfect. None of us are. But the first step in making a difference, in changing the way we see each other, is recognizing our own biases and deciding that we won't let them dictate our actions anymore." As Marcus spoke, he noticed a few people nodding, their expressions thoughtful, their eyes a little brighter, as though the words had ignited something within them. He felt a surge of hope, the kind of hope that only comes when you realize that change is possible, that the smallest of actions can lead to something much bigger. The man across the aisle, who had once accused him of not belonging, now looked up at Marcus, his face unreadable, but his posture soft, his shoulders no longer tense. For a brief moment, their eyes met, no words were exchanged, but in that silent connection, something unspoken passed between them. "You see," Marcus continued, his voice softer now, "we all have the power to change, to challenge the assumptions that keep us apart, to see each other not for what we are, but for who we truly are." As he finished speaking, a woman seated in the back of the plane stood up. She was older, her face lined with years of wisdom, but there was something new in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you for reminding us of what really matters, for showing us that we can be better, for showing us that we have to do better." The applause that followed was spontaneous, heartfelt, and loud. It wasn't just for Marcus. It was for everyone in that cabin who had allowed themselves to see, for a brief moment, the world through someone else's eyes. Marcus sat back down, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. This was why he had fought so hard for this moment, not for recognition, but for the chance to ignite change. And as the applause died down, he felt something shift inside him. This was just the beginning. As the applause subsided, a profound stillness settled over the cabin. Marcus Bennett leaned back in his seat, his heart beating steadily now, the earlier rush of adrenaline replaced by a calm, reflective resolve. This wasn't the first time he had faced a moment like this, but it felt different. It felt meaningful. He glanced around the cabin, catching the eyes of passengers who, just minutes earlier, had been silent observers. Now Their gazes held something new: respect, understanding, and perhaps even gratitude. Marcus could sense the shift, the unspoken acknowledgement that this was more than just a moment on a plane. It was a lesson, an awakening. As the plane continued its journey toward Los Angeles, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. His mind drifted to the many roads that had brought him here, roads paved with triumphs and challenges, with moments of soaring pride and gut-wrenching disappointment. He thought of his mother, a woman who had worked tirelessly to provide for him and his siblings. She had always taught him to hold his head high, to never let the world's injustices define his sense of worth. Her words echoed in his mind now, as vivid as if she were sitting beside him. Marcus, the world may not always see you for who you are, but you must never stop showing them. You are not their assumptions, you are your actions. It was that wisdom that had carried him through law school, through sleepless nights preparing for cases, through moments of doubt when the weight of proving himself felt unbearable. And it was that wisdom that had guided him today, compelling him to stand firm in the face of bias and demand accountability, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. Across the aisle, the man who had accused him of not belonging shifted in his seat. His earlier discomfort had given way to something quieter, more introspective. Marcus could see it in the way the man avoided meeting his eyes, in the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own realization. It wasn't anger that Marcus felt toward him now. It was something closer to pity, a recognition that the man had been trapped by his own ignorance, his own narrow view of the world. But Marcus also felt hope. Hope that this experience might open the man's eyes, that it might spark a change in how he saw others. The flight attendant approached Marcus with a hesitant smile, her hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, "I just want to thank you for what you said. It really made me think. I've seen situations like this before, but I never really thought about how much harm they cause. I'm sorry for how I handled it earlier. I'll do better." Marcus smiled gently, nodding. "Acknowledging it is the first step," he replied. "We all have room to grow. What matters is that we're willing to do the work." The flight attendant's eyes glistened with emotion as she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered before retreating back to the galley. Marcus turned his gaze to the window, the sprawling landscape below illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. It reminded him of the countless people who would never have the chance to speak up, who would endure similar situations in silence because they felt they had no choice. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about them. A young man seated a few rows ahead turned to face Marcus. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice tinged with nervousness. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've seen things like this happen, but I've never known what to do. Watching you handle it, it inspired me. It showed me that we don't have to stay quiet." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. "It's not always easy," he said, "but standing up for what's right is always worth it. The important thing is to start. Small actions lead to big changes." The young man nodded, his expression thoughtful, before turning back to his seat. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Marcus felt a profound sense of clarity. This moment, as exhausting as it had been, was a reminder of why he did what he did. As a lawyer, as a leader, and as a human being, his mission was to challenge bias, to spark conversations that led to understanding, and to inspire others to do the same. When the plane landed, the passengers began gathering their belongings, the usual rush of travel resuming. But the atmosphere felt different, quieter, more contemplative. As Marcus stood to retrieve his bag, the man across the aisle finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Bennett, I really am sorry. I've got a lot to think about." Marcus looked at him, his expression kind but resolute. "Thinking is a good start," he said. "But change comes from action. Don't let this moment pass without doing something with it." The man nodded, his face a mix of humility and gratitude. As Marcus walked off the plane, the air of the Los Angeles evening greeted him like a long-lost friend. He felt lighter, as though the weight of the day had lifted. This wasn't the end of the story, it never was. But it was a step forward, a ripple in the vast ocean of change. And that was enough. The cool Los Angeles breeze brushed against Marcus Bennett's face as he stepped out of the airport, his carry-on bag in hand. The day's events replayed in his mind, not as a source of frustration, but as a tapestry of moments that had revealed deeper truths about bias, about humanity, and about the power of standing firm in one's convictions. As Marcus waited for his ride, his thoughts shifted to the people still on the plane. The young man who had thanked him, the flight attendant who had vowed to do better, the older woman whose words of gratitude had resonated with so many. And of course, the man across the aisle, the one who had set everything in motion. Marcus wondered what that man was thinking now. Was he replaying his words, feeling the sting of embarrassment, or perhaps the first pangs of genuine understanding? Change wasn't easy, Marcus knew. It wasn't something that happened overnight. But every journey began with a single step, and today had been a step for that man, however small. The hum of nearby conversations and the occasional honk of a car horn brought Marcus back to the present. He pulled out his phone and opened an email draft he had started weeks ago. It was addressed to the board of Skylex Airlines, a proposal for a mandatory training program on bias and cultural awareness for all employees. Today's experience had only solidified the importance of his idea. Bias wasn't just a moral failing, it was bad business. It undermined trust, created unnecessary conflict, and alienated customers. Marcus had seen it play out too many times in his career, and he was determined to use his platform to drive meaningful change. Before he could overthink it, Marcus hit send. The email disappeared into the ether, a small but significant action toward a better future. His ride pulled up a sleek black sedan with a friendly driver who greeted him warmly. As Marcus settled into the back seat, he gazed out the window, the city's lights stretching endlessly before him. "You look deep in thought," the driver said, glancing at Marcus in the rearview mirror. Marcus smiled faintly. "It's been a long day," he admitted. "Good long or bad long?" the driver asked, his tone genuinely curious. Marcus considered the question for a moment. "Both," he said finally. "But I think it's a day that mattered." The driver nodded, as if he understood more than Marcus had said. "Sometimes those are the best kind," he replied. Marcus leaned back, letting the quiet hum of the car soothe him. His mind drifted to the ripple effects of what had happened on that plane. He thought of how the passengers would carry the experience with them, sharing the story with friends, family, and colleagues. He thought of how those conversations might spark new ones, challenging assumptions and encouraging introspection. He imagined the young man on the plane, perhaps stepping up the next time he witnessed an act of bias. Or the flight attendant, approaching her role with a renewed sense of purpose, ensuring that no passenger felt the sting of prejudice on her watch. And then there was the man who had accused him. Marcus didn't expect an overnight transformation, but he hoped the man's discomfort would linger not as a punishment, but as a catalyst for change. Growth often came from the most uncomfortable places. The car stopped at a red light, and Marcus glanced at his reflection in the window. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of the day. He thought about the countless others who faced bias daily, who didn't have the platform or the confidence to push back. Marcus had always believed in the power of stories, how they could open minds, build empathy, and inspire action. Today had been its own kind of story, one that had unfolded in real time, with an audience that hadn't realized they were part of something bigger. As the car pulled up to his destination, Marcus stepped out, thanking the driver with a warm handshake. The night air was crisp, the kind that made every breath feel refreshing and grounding. He stood for a moment, taking it all in: the city lights, the distant hum of life moving forward, the sense that this day, for all its challenges, had been a step toward something greater. Marcus pulled out his phone one last time, opening a note he had titled, "What Matters Most." He typed a single sentence before putting the phone back in his pocket. Change begins when we refuse to let silence speak for us. With that, Marcus walked toward his home, the echoes of the day still fresh, but the promise of tomorrow lighting his path. The soft glow of morning light filtered through Marcus Bennett's apartment windows as he sat at his desk, sipping a steaming cup of coffee. The events of the previous day felt both distant and immediate, like a dream he couldn't quite shake. Yet, it wasn't a dream, it was a stark reminder of the world he lived in and the work still left to do. Marcus opened his laptop, greeted by the flood of emails that had arrived overnight. Among them was a message from Skylex Airline's CEO, thanking him for handling the situation on the plane with dignity and professionalism. There was also a note from the young man who had spoken to him during the flight, expressing gratitude for the courage Marcus had shown. As Marcus read through the messages, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. The incident on the plane had started as a moment of humiliation, but it had evolved into something much greater. It was now a story with the power to challenge, inspire, and transform. He leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to the passengers he had left behind on that flight. What seeds had been planted in their hearts? Would they carry the memory of his words into their own lives, using them as a lens to examine their assumptions and biases? Marcus thought about the man across the aisle, whose silence had spoken volumes by the end of the flight. Would he take the discomfort he felt and turn it into action? Marcus hoped so. Growth was rarely comfortable, but it was always necessary. The ringing of his phone pulled Marcus from his thoughts. It was a call from one of his closest friends, Angela Wright, a civil rights advocate and community leader. "Marcus," Angela said warmly, her voice filled with pride. "I heard what happened on that flight. News travels fast." Marcus chuckled softly. "It wasn't exactly how I planned to spend my evening, but I suppose it was necessary." "Necessary is an understatement," Angela replied. "What you said was powerful. It's not just about that moment. It's about what that moment can teach people." "You turned a personal attack into a lesson for everyone in that cabin," Marcus sighed, his tone reflective. "But is it enough? How do we make sure it doesn't end there, that it doesn't just fade into the background like so many other moments?" "That's why I'm calling," Angela said. "This isn't just your story, Marcus. It's a story that belongs to all of us. We need to share it, amplify it, and use it to start conversations that might not otherwise happen." Marcus nodded, the weight of her words settling in. He had always believed in the power of storytelling, but Angela's perspective reminded him of its ripple effect, the way one story could spark countless others, creating waves of change. As they ended the call, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He began drafting a public statement, carefully choosing his words to convey not just the events of the flight, but the deeper lessons it held. He wrote about the importance of confronting bias, about the courage it took to speak up in moments of injustice, and about the collective responsibility to challenge assumptions that divide us. He shared his hope that the incident would inspire others to reflect on their own actions and choices. The response was immediate. Messages of support flooded his inbox, and social media buzzed with discussions about his story. People from all walks of life shared their own experiences of bias, their struggles, and their determination to create a more inclusive world. Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Change wasn't instantaneous, it was a process, one that required persistence, empathy, and a willingness to listen. But as he watched the conversation unfold, he felt a spark of hope. That evening, Marcus attended a community event Angela had organized. The room was filled with people from diverse backgrounds, united by a common goal: to create a world where everyone felt seen, valued, and respected. As Marcus stood before them to share his story, he felt a swell of emotion. His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of his journey and the hope for what lay ahead. "We all have a role to play," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. What matters is what you do with the moments you're given. When you see bias, when you see injustice, don't stay silent. Speak up. Stand firm. And remember that even the smallest actions can create the biggest waves." The applause that followed wasn't just for Marcus. It was for the collective realization that change was possible, that each person in that room had the power to make a difference. As the evening ended, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey wasn't over, but it was moving in the right direction. And that, he thought, was more than enough for now. Standing outside under the stars, Marcus took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. His mother's words echoed in his mind once more. "You are not their assumptions, you are your actions." He smiled, his resolve as strong as ever. Marcus knew that the story he had started on that plane was far from finished. It would continue to unfold in the lives of those who had heard it, in the conversations it sparked, and in the changes it inspired. And for Marcus, that was the greatest victory of all.